You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by Dr. Ann Burgess and Steven Constantine, authors of A Killer by Design, Murderers, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Ann and Steven, thank you for joining us on Mind Over Murder today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, we're happy to be here.
Let's go ahead and start by having you both tell our listeners about your personal and professional backgrounds. And so, Ann, I'll start with you, and then we'll flip it right to Steven.
Sure. Okay. I am a psychiatric nurse. I have my doctorate in nursing science. I've been an academic most of my life and currently at Boston College at the Connell School of Nursing. I also have a small private practice. Much of my work is teaching or doing research. I've been at Boston College now. I was at Boston College in the 70s when the project with the rape started with Linda Holmstrom, then went to University of Pennsylvania, and then have come back to Boston College.
Steven, how about you?
Sure. Yeah. So I do marketing and communications here at Boston College, which is how Dr. Burgess and I met. And my background in writing is I have an MFA in writing and literature from Bennington College in Vermont.
I think that leads us to the natural question. So how do the two of you end up as writing partners?
The most obvious thing is we both are at Boston College, at the Connell School of Nursing. So we're housed, if you will, our offices are in the same building. In fact, I'm one floor above Steven. Steven had just arrived a little bit. I think I'll let him give you more of the timeline. But when he came and he started right off really getting into the communications and so forth, and actually set up a Mindhunter had just come out. This was about in the 2018. And Mindhunter had just come out. And we had invited John Douglas, who of course is the author of Mindhunter, to come. And I think in the context of having to work on that project and get it ready for a very large audience, there's a very large student audience that we had, that we really talked more about the cases that I had done and some of my work, et cetera. So I'll let Steven fill in from there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. We met working on that Mindhunter event that we held here at Boston College. Douglas was going to come up, have a conversation with Dr. Burgess here in front of students and staff and alum to talk about what it was really like behind the scenes at the FBI, developing criminal profiling and working on some of these cases. And as we were prepping for that event, I spent a lot of time talking to Dr. Burgess to learn about her experiences. I was just amazed by it. Her perspective, the work she was doing behind the scenes to take the data and to turn it into, to take all this really sort of disparate content and data and to analyze it and to turn it into a structured methodology for criminal profiling was really interesting, really compelling. It's nothing that had been shared before. So I started gently prodding her to get her story out into the world. And she was interested in doing it in maybe a form of teaching or some online modules for students to learn from, because that's always been very important for her, is using her experience to teach others. But we eventually wrote a few test chapters together and settled on the idea of a book, and it just took off pretty quickly from there.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add is it was originally way back in when we started with the FBI profilers, it was intended to be two projects. One, which we did complete, which was on the patterns of sexual homicide. And that book did come out. But the second was on the profiling. And it just, I think what happened is so many of the agents retired and I was moving on. I was at University of Pennsylvania. And so all of the materials, luckily I kept all of the materials. We had transcribed all of the meetings and the sessions where they would rate the cases. So I had all of that, and luckily, no rain or how cellars get, it was still pretty much intact. And that's what Steven asked if he could see some of it, and I think realized that there was a lot of very important information that we could use from that.
I have been a John Douglas fan from way back, probably far too early. I started reading John when I was maybe 15 or 16, probably way too early. But I knew that there had been a woman named Ann Burgess who worked on the profiling project too. And I always wondered, why do we not have her story yet? So when I saw your book in Barnes and Noble, like right as it came out, I did a little jump for joy in the aisle. It's very embarrassing of me to have done it. But I was so excited because I was like, this is the missing piece of the puzzle. We finally get her story. I'm so thrilled. What was that seminar like that you put together, the two of you up in front of a group of students? That must have been amazing. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that. What was that like?
Yeah, it really was. And I think we had the questions. We had a moderator, which was, I think, very helpful to pitch the questions to us. John was his usual self, vintage John, I call him, and he would tell some of the stories. Not so much at there, but afterwards, because some of the stories are pretty intense. So we didn't want to scare away the audience at any rate. But John's always been, in fact, I went back and read the inscription that he had put in the book, and he says, it's about time that you got your story out. I said, yeah, I'm a slow writer. But thank heavens I had Steven to help. Because it's a very different style than I was used to. I had to do academic writing, which is very dull and boring, I think, just the facts. And Steve was able to certainly make it come much more alive than I would have been able to.
Do you enjoy the writing process? And is it helpful?
I hate writing.
I was wondering.
I hate writing, yeah. And yet I did 15 textbooks before this, and I've certainly done a couple hundred articles. You have to, if you stay in academia, you have to get tenure and all of that. But no, it's not easy. That's why I was amazed that Steven seems to be able to just, because that's his interest and that's what he was trained for.
So do you enjoy teaching then, flipping that around? Because clearly you've been a professor for all of these years, and I know your classes are sold out, fully enrolled, and are incredibly popular. Is that where you get more of your enjoyment in terms of the academia and your storytelling?
Yes, I come from a clinical base, and so I feel that the best way to teach is through clinical examples. So it was pretty natural to put the cases on, and I was teaching the students as much for what the cases were about as for prevention. Because when you hear, my husband's a pilot, and so he said that when they sit around in the hangar, they tell all their war stories because there might just be something that they remember that gets them out of a tight situation. That's the mentality that I had, is to tell them so that they, as I said, they might not get in the situation or be able to get out of it.
By the way, this amazing event that you had a couple of years ago with John, the two of you, I can't imagine what a privilege that would be. Was it recorded? Would anybody ever be able to see it who wasn't there that night at Boston College?
Yeah, we have the recording. We can definitely forward it to you guys and you can link to it. Yep.
And would that be something that would ever be shown publicly?
Yeah, I think it's on YouTube or Vimeo, so it's publicly available. So yeah, we'd be happy to share that and your audience can check it out as well. It was great. Working with Ann is great. She's fantastic. She's a great storyteller, amazing experience. And then John is very much a character. Him being on stage was a lot of fun, and just their dynamic was a lot of fun. So it's definitely worth watching for sure.
We've interviewed Mark Olshaker, who knows Kristin quite well, and he has also been just a joy for us to be around. I'll let Kristin tell you a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with John. He's always writing another book, he and Mark, and they've got two coming out or in the works.
That's a high bar.
Yeah, I said it's a very high bar. I said to Steven, we've got to increase our productivity here a bit.
So, Steven, is true crime something that you've always had an interest in, or did that develop when you started working with Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, I think it definitely developed through Dr. Burgess. It's not something that I had a strong interest in before. And even still, it was definitely her story that was more interesting to me than the true crime aspect. And I think that's what separates her story from a lot of the agents is there's no sensationalism, there's no added gore or anything like that. And one of the things she made clear to me very early on was that this is a book that has to keep the victim front and center. I want it to be about the victim. And like she had spoken to moments ago, maybe people can learn something from this if we keep it honest and truthful and with the victim in mind. I like that approach. It seemed a little bit different. It seemed very compassionate. So I was really interested in telling that story, her story, as opposed to worrying too much about the true crime aspect itself.
So it's 5 years to bring this book to fruition. Is that right?
But maybe 4, but yeah, it was definitely a long process.
How does your process work and how did you find the time to do this? Because you clearly both have very busy schedules.
COVID came.
Yeah. COVID.
Okay.
That is true. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we had more time because for 1 or 2 semesters, we had to do the virtual teaching. There weren't students around or anything, so we could just kind of keep moving along. I know that was one of the things. Maybe Steven has another suggestion of how it went.
I think one of the things that was tricky to begin with was like Dr. Burgess said, she's held on to all these archival materials from her work with the BSU. So combing through that and figuring out which cases we wanted to use to help tell the story of the evolution of criminal profiling, it took a while to figure that out. So I think that was the tricky part, is that there was just so much material to just figure out what the real kernel of knowledge was. And then once we got going, it was pretty quick back and forth. For the first couple of months, like Dr. Burgess said, her office was above mine. So she would just swing down. We would chat about ideas, chat about case, and then we would send emails of chapters back and forth and keep revising. And then once COVID, not having to worry about a commute and just seeming to have a little bit more free time, we were really able to dive on in. And then we found our agent who had some ideas of how to change things up. And then she got us our editor who had some ideas of how to change things up. So there was a lot of people involved, a lot of evolution to the process. So it takes longer than you might expect.
Did you then shift over to working virtually with the two of you as well, so that you were both working from remote locations?
Yeah.
We did.
And I wanted to ask you something. As the brother of a murder victim, my sister Kathy Thomas and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski were murdered as part of the Colonial Parkway murders, which has been an FBI case since day one. Now, my experience is obviously not from inside the Bureau. It's from outside the Bureau. But we find that the Bureau is terrible about information sharing. I was curious. Now, here you are, you're coming in and you're being brought in, I think initially as a consultant, if I understood your history clearly enough. How is it you still have all of the paperwork and your notes? Wasn't there anything that the FBI said, oh no, this belongs to us, this is our work product, from those studies that you did and the analysis?
Because it was a study and we had a small grant I had a team up in Boston that was taking the data. And so it was a National Institute of Justice grant. And we set it up. Your question is very good. We were very concerned that people couldn't get access to all of these interviews and so forth. That's really how we handled it.
So did the work product belong to you then, as opposed to the Bureau? Because they're usually very big on control.
They are absolutely are. Yeah, they are.
Did you have to get permission, for example, to write the book or use any of the examples from the work that you had done? Or was that clear enough in terms of authorship?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the advantages that was so far. It was a good 20, 30 years ago. The first book we did, the sexual homicide book we did, that had to go through they take 30 days and somebody has to review it, et cetera, et cetera. But this one we didn't have to because it was not considered a Bureau product. It was considered, it just wasn't. I know I had asked John about that, and he didn't seem to think there was any need to at this point in time.
One element along those lines that we did pay a lot of attention to, and it was with the victims who were minors at the time, we did make sure to make their names more ambiguous and to take those out so as not to cause any hurt or challenges for the families.
I was just going to say, I will say that some people did try to get access to the interviews, but nobody could find them.
Were these on reel-to-reel tapes back in the day?
Yeah, they were all transcribed.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I also wanted to make sure that I asked about the crime classification manual. Can you talk a little bit about writing the crime classification manual? I think it's on 3rd edition right now. Do you have to go back and make changes and revisions to this, or how does that work?
Yeah, that was an interesting book because we modeled it after the what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the Bible, so to speak, of the psychiatric group. And so we broke all the agents up into groups, and they would meet on the various crimes that we had. We divided, if you've looked at it, into homicide and rape and child and arson. The real important thing was giving the examples. We had to have, again, we didn't get them from the agents. We wrote up cases, but we really used our own write-up of that for that. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting because we really wanted to see if law enforcement could classify the crimes, because they didn't have any way of just talking about it like in the DSM, what is schizophrenia, or what is depression, or something like that. And so dividing it into the classifications we felt was a major step. And it was accepted by the agents. Now you're right, we're up to the 3rd edition. We haven't done any more. I'm not sure. I've gone into a different area. So it would be up to me. I don't know whether John's interested in redoing it, but I think that's where we're at, so to speak.
Were there arguments or intense discussions behind the scenes? In other words, you had to make decisions about where you were going to put things. And this was all incredibly innovative at the time.
Yes, and John and Bob Ressler, don't forget Bob was a big person involved in all of this, and they would be the overall supervisors, so to speak, with these groups to make sure that the characteristics and the search warrant information and all that was as good as it could be. Now, whether they got into arguments, agents always got into arguments. Let me tell you that you've got a group of men that really have some pretty high egos. So it's always been fun. I always thought it was fun to see what they would argue over from a professional standpoint, from a law enforcement standpoint, to your question.
I've never heard anyone call him Bob either. In other words, Robert Ressler was this, again, incredibly prominent figure in this world. You know him well enough to call him Bob.
Oh, yes. Oh, we worked hard on that and on the project. We had meetings down, of course, at Quantico, but they would come up and we'd meet in my house. We'd sit around the dining room table and work out cases.
Wow.
And they stayed at the house. The government wasn't so good on giving out much money for their expenses. So we were on a shoestring, if you want to know.
You'd save money by having them stay at the house.
Sure, yeah. And then we'd eat right through dinner and keep working. They were very hard workers. Yes. Wow.
Did you have any sense that you were making history? This is unbelievable stuff. The team, the group of people that worked on this thing.
And you have to realize they were on their own time, which I think was remarkable. They really were on their own time. At least Ressler and Douglas certainly were on their own time. Quantico, of course, they would come in. The others would come in. The other profilers would come in. But it was John and Bob that would come up, and they'd come up to Boston City Hospital is where we had our research group. So they'd come over there, and we'd look at the data.
That's really awesome. So then at this point, when you set out to write your book with Steven, had you read John and Roy Hazelwood and Bob Ressler's books about their days with the BSU?
Oh yeah, I have they always would give me copies because we stayed in touch. Yeah. So I'd always call them. There was a case and I'd want to know what I should get from them to tell the students. They loved it. And in fact, we're still in touch with several of what I call the first generation profilers, several from the second and third generation. And that's important because they were trained by Bob and John. And so the ones that came after them, or more current ones, not having that training, I think makes a difference. But Ressler and Douglas were really experts at. It's uncanny how they could go to a crime scene and figure it all out. But yeah.
Steven, did you read all of this too in preparation, or did you want to set yourself apart from all of that subject matter?
A little bit of both. One of the great things about working with Dr. Burgess, too, is that she does maintain all these connections to a lot of these retired agents and to people all over the law enforcement and FBI world. We've had conversations with some of these people to learn a little bit more about their stories as well, or they've zoomed in to lecture at one of Dr. Burgess's classes. Definitely their input was very helpful, and Dr. Burgess sent chapters out to them as well to make sure everything was as accurate as possible. So that was a great benefit. Absolutely.
Did you find that your recollections and theirs were fairly consistent, or were there areas where you were like, I remember it like this, and John was like, actually, no, it was like this? Were there ever areas where you argued about this is what actually happened?
I wouldn't argue because they were the ones that were there. And I can remember I actually could say yes to your question because they would have, for example, when they interviewed Barry John Simonis, both Ken Lanning and Roy Hazelwood. Now, Ken Lanning is still alive, and he gave me quite some insight on that because it was only a 20-minute tape that they made at the end of 8 hours of interview. So he had a lot of things to say about it that didn't make it into the tape. Their memories are great. Judd Ray, for example, they all did really important things at that time. So I think your point about they were making history. Judd Ray did one of the first cases on an Alaska family murder where he was able to come in as an expert to talk about it. And up until that time, the agents hadn't been serving as experts. And I'm trying to think of Greg Cooper, who now runs a cold case foundation, and we're part of that. He's a fantastic profiler. You should get him on one of your times. He had the guy. He had murdered two separate persons. And so he testified the first time and they won because he was qualified. It was one of the first times that the agent was qualified. And then on the second one, the guy said to him, the defendant said to him, "Not you again, coming in to
Oh, no.
get me." He said that right to Greg. So it was funny. So they all had important roles to play in the criminal justice system back in those times, because this is back in the 90s when they were trying to get some of these serial killers. All of the cases in the book were from the 36. We had an original list, I think, of some 80 or 82, and we whittled it down to the 36 that we thought we could get, the agent could get interviews with. So that's where, and so many of those cases are in Mindhunter and certainly in Roy Hazelwood's book and Ressler's book. So it's interesting to go back and read them after I've read through some of the profiling material that we had. And so there is and then if there's some conflict, I have to go and call them. I have to call John a lot to see how his memory is on some of these cases, because it's going back, 30 years.
How unusual was it, and for you as a woman, to be working in that field?
Very unusual.
Were people put off by it? Did they think that it was weird that a woman, even a woman with your professional background, was studying?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so, because my field was victimology, and that's why they had invited me down. That was not their area. Don't forget, they're investigators, so they're looking for the bad guy. As far as they were concerned, the victim, of course, was victim, but they wouldn't pay much attention. And so bringing in the whole victim aspect turned their work into, that became one of the first things. If you read any of their material, is who's the victim? Why is she there? What led up to it, et cetera, et cetera. And so they start their profiling from that standpoint of the victim. So being down there, and they knew about my rape study. So it wasn't that I was in any way invading, quote, their territory. So there was no feeling of that. They might feel that way with other consultants coming in, but it was because I could bring them something that they didn't have. And they respected that. And I think that's why we all got along so well.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Stephen, earlier you were alluding to the fact that you wanted the book to be very victim-centric. And of course, as people who are victims advocates, and Bill being the brother of a murder victim, we really appreciated the fact that it is so victim-centric. True crime is a genre where a lot of times there is too much focus on the killers and there is not enough on the victim. What would you say are the things that consumers of true crime need to be aware of in order to honor the victims and not mythologize the killers?
And not bring their bias in. I think that's the problem. So many times they don't want to identify with the victim. Nobody wants to be the victim. So they might say, why was the victim doing this? Or why was the victim doing that? Rather than, because the more they could deny that would be any behavior that they would do made a difference. They wouldn't be able to understand the victim. So I think that's the biggest hurdle, is to confront people's bias. Might say also those are the myths that are out there. But if the victim is found because she was hitchhiking, say, back in those days, that was a big thing.
Yeah.
They would blame her. There was so much of the blame the victim and not enough of who's the suspect. Being able to talk about the impact on the victim, we felt was really important.
There's also just that phenomenon of Hollywood glossing over stuff and making everything into its most consumable and universally consumable form. Yeah. You see these serial killers who look charming on TV, who are handsome, who are real smooth talkers and all this. And there's something almost identifiable about that. And I think the barriers become a little bit thin. So that can be a bit of an issue that people have to pay attention to as well. Yeah, I think just sharing the victim stories, and they're real people. Their families were affected. It's very traumatic. So instead of mythologizing the killer, but just showing the victim side of the story as well is important.
And with all the work that you did, were you surprised at how this mythology began to develop? The thing that Steven's talking about, the charming serial killer?
Some of them are charming.
No,
they really are.
But the myth is out there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We write about that in one of the chapters of the agents talking about who's your favorite serial killer, that they even have favorites. So it's not just myth, it's reality, that they become so fascinated with what these killers do. How much of that is personality can be a factor. If they're psychopaths, they're going to be very charming. They're going to try to con, and I successfully do. That's what was good about the agent going in and interviewing them. I think that is important to say, because I felt they really turned into being more victim oriented. So when they went in, they would know the case cold, so that the inmate couldn't con them, and they would confront them. I think you even saw that on Netflix. There was a couple of cases, I think, with Jerry Brudos, where he had taken this picture and his face was right in the photograph, and they confronted there. I remember that was one of the good segments that they did. And they're going in as FBI agents, carrying the authority. I think the other thing is many of these guys we found in the research had a missing father, the absent father, if you will. So here are these FBI agents that stand for authority, male authority, so to speak, coming in. It was a high point for them, and they could feel some status among the other inmates. I'm sure that was part of what they got out of it.
I remember a story from John where he was talking about how Charles Manson got onto a chair to give himself a little bit more height over John when John was interviewing him to establish dominance and sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
So it sounds like you've watched Mindhunter. Steven, have you watched Mindhunter? Are you a fan?
Yeah, I watched the first season of it. I thought it was well done. They could have gone a different route with Dr. Burgess' character there, but the cases were really well done.
Yeah, we did want to ask specifically about that. Anna Torv does play the character of Dr. Wendy Carr. I know she is supposed to be based on you. First of all, did Anna Torv actually speak to you about your work? Like, have you talked with her as she was preparing for the role?
Nope. No contact. And John had the same experience. Yeah, John had the same experience. He was amazed that Moore didn't talk. For some reason, is it Pincer, whoever was the producer, there was a very tight role for what they could do. They never reached out.
That's interesting. David Fincher is the key creative person behind the stories. And I don't know if Kristin feels the same way. It was actually my favorite television show of the last couple of years. I thought it was amazing, but I'm actually really surprised that they wouldn't have had the actors portraying you sit down with you. They often do that for film and television roles.
If you notice, they couldn't have been more wrong on any of our backgrounds. If you know anything about us, they couldn't have. Maybe they did try to just be absolutely opposite. I don't know. You'd have to ask them. But they had it so crazy in terms of Ressler and Douglas and their backgrounds. Anyway, they had me as a psychologist, if you can believe that. Isn't that awful?
So Fincher never reached out to you in any capacity? He never talked to you about your character? Or wow, that's blowing my mind.
I didn't know anything about it. I'm trying to think of who said that for us to see it. And so I wasn't even sure in the beginning what it was. And then I started going online and reading some of it.
I think you read a news article that mentioned you.
That's it. Okay.
And you said, there's a show that involves a character based.
Yeah.
But Douglas did consult on the project. So he was involved. I don't know to what degree, but he had a voice in there at least.
He did on the cases, and the cases were good. I agree with Steven that the cases were well done. But they should have been. They had all the script. They had the script, but what they didn't have was the script on our backgrounds. they really had John as this kind of bumbling FBI agent.
Right.
He's all into all this female dating and crazy stuff there. And then on Bob Ressler, they have him having this son that's going to be a serial killer. That's really so far out.
And they had you as a glamorous lesbian they had the Boston part, but the rest of it falls apart.
That was about it. Yeah, that was about it.
I think your children have something to say about that, Dr.
My son called me, said, "What had you told us, Mother?"
Yeah. Is this you, Mom? So the backstory is, for several of the key characters, is just completely made up, it sounds like.
It is. Yeah, it is. I don't know where they were going with it. And I think that hurt them second season. I know I've heard some of that from some of the people that were more involved, that it got too wild and too far away from the cases, which was really the strength, I thought, of the program, the cases.
I would have to agree. And I was very disappointed they didn't bring it back. But I think the kind of weird backstories weren't really doing it in moving the story forward, because there's so much really fascinating information that could have been brought out by all of the amazing cases that you all worked on.
They didn't do half of the cases that we had. Yeah.
So if there was going to be a season 3, what are the cases you'd like to see them highlight?
The one that we have in our book. We've got some good ones in the book. Yeah.
The Henry Lee Wallace, I know, was of particular importance, and I think that would be interesting to see them highlight a bit more on the show.
The other one is Monty Rissell.
I was about to say.
No, they did include him, but they didn't. They just did a short thing on Monty. Monty may get out. He's been a very good inmate, and he may get out because he keeps going up for parole, and he organizes the baseball team, and he does all kinds of good things down there. He's down in Virginia there. I'm trying to think of who else, Steven, did we...
Simonis and Jobert are both really interesting.
Jobert. Yes.
Yeah.
Jean Jobert, very interesting case. Learned a lot from him in terms of his really cemented in our early theory that something goes on in the childhood of these guys that just stays with their heads, stays with them, and it gets acted out by the time they get up to adolescence and young adulthood.
Had such haunting interviews, too, after he was caught, talking about immediately after killing the second boy in Nebraska and just going to a McDonald's, washing his hands of blood in the bathroom and getting some food, having a meal, and then going home and sleeping it all off. Just the coldness that he showed and the level of meticulous detail he put into his crimes it's terrifying.
Yeah, but it has to be. If they ever felt what they were doing, they wouldn't do it. So for whatever turns them off, turns that ability off, is really key of how that plays a big role in their killing.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because it seems like there's this pattern. What do you think it is that creates cold-blooded monsters on some level?
Right. It's the killing of the feeling of any kind of empathy for another person. So that has to come from some early experience. It isn't, if you want to look at the nature or nurture, everybody says, was it nature or nurture? That it's got to come from somewhere. What we found was so important is with these men is the early absence of the father and it's true, they have a lot of the fractured relationships between the parents. The parents are always yelling and fighting and so forth. One of the important things I think in the Jobert case that the mother told us is that she knows that her son had witnessed the husband choking her unconscious, so that it wasn't just a little verbal thing. And she knows that Jean was there, but when we talked to him, he had no memory of that. Now, he was still a child. He was under 5, but that could have registered at some point because much of his fantasies and his killing had to do with that. Back to your question, something gets turned off in the normal development.
From everything that Dr. Burgess shared with me, including these interviews, recording, confessions, it just seems like there's this moment where something traumatic happens as to these killers as a child. And they take that and then something strange happens where that then becomes sort of their fuel for fantasy. They try and take control over this moment from their childhood where they felt they didn't have any control. They practice this fantasy. This fantasy gets more and more complex. They're the god of this little world that they've created. And then it becomes so authentic to them that they take this fantasy that's been in their head for all these years and they act it out in the real world because it seems more authentic to them than reality itself. And yeah, there's this disassociation. They disconnect from the real world and they connect to this fantasy structure that they have. And then that's what becomes sacred to them.
Kemper, that was a good example if you wanted. Yeah.
One of our friends of the podcast, and just friends in general, Jim Clementi, who was a profiler, he has talked to us about killing has to meet the offender's emotional needs somehow. And that sounds a lot like what you're both putting out here about that.
But of course, it never really does, or it only temporarily meets that emotional need because serial killers by nature are out there killing again. So they're constantly chasing after that, trying to perfect something. But again, if it's in their head, it can never really be perfected in the real world.
Yeah, and they say that the killing isn't like they fantasize it, that it's not as good as they fantasize. It's not perfect, so they have to go and do it again. So that whole repetitive issue is really important. All the more reason to catch them as soon as you can.
Right. And Joubert talked about having to get it right, having to get the fantasy. Mm-hmm. And that's why he cut off a hunk of flesh from one of his victims, is that didn't match to whatever his idea of right was.
Yeah, he was interesting because he had these, what he called his cannibal fantasies. He wanted to eat his babysitter from when he was 5 or 6. Now, come on, that's really young.
So she was all gone.
Yeah. Yep. Eat her till she was all gone.
One of the things we've seen in recent years in discussing the Colonial Parkway murders and other cases with current profilers is a modification or maybe a distancing from certain ideas that seem to come up over the years, which is that serial killers have types of people that they attack, types of victims. They seem to be really stepping away from that, and they talk a lot more about serial killers don't just have a single type of victim. They don't just kill nonstop. In other words, they start and they stop. They've used examples in discussions with us about gaps in serial killers' trajectory of murder that they may stop for months or even years at a time. Do you feel like the ideas that were generated from the early studies have changed?
I wouldn't say they changed because I've kept up with serial killers in these times, and you can still find many of the concepts that we had. I think there are different types of serial killers, and that's what I think is important, is there's not one recipe, but there's a number. And I mean, Joubert, and you can ask them the same question. And he just made it clear on the interview that why did he pick that particular boy? And he said he was alone. Now, we don't know whether there was other. Of course, this is 6 a.m. This was a little newspaper boy that was delivering his papers. We also in the interview found out he had really been watching. He goes out hunting. A lot of them just go out hunting every night. And when everything is right is when they strike. So even though he said, yeah, he was alone, he was just waiting for somebody to be alone rather than he spotted one.
And he might have to go out night after night.
They do. That's as much the prelude, if you will, the hunting. Absolutely. And we don't realize that. And that's why now I think that we've educated law enforcement that when you have a victim and you ask them what kinds of behavior, have you noticed any odd behavior by anybody prior to this kind of thing? Obviously not in a murder, but in other things.
That engaging in hunting behaviors.
Yeah. And try to use that kind of behavior on some of these awful cases that we have coming up, some of these shooting cases, and how many red flags they leave. Nobody's paying attention to these red flags. It's amazing. So I think that your question about how much over 30 years has things changed, you always are learning something new, and that's important, absolutely important to do that, and to see how much they do match or do not match and what are the differences.
I'm going to say the one thing that has really increased over the last 30 years definitely has been the school shooter or the mass killer. And as a high school teacher, that is something that is on my mind every single day. Absolutely. When I go into my school building, is something going to happen today involving a kid with a gun? Was that something that you all could ever have predicted was going to happen when you started at the BSU back then? Sorry.
What was interesting is one of the interviews with Ed Kemper. He was tired. Remember, he had to tell the police that he had killed all these people. He turned himself in. And in that later in that interview, we found out that he was next preparing for a mass shooting. He was going to change his MO, so to speak. Teachers, by the way, mentioning teachers are so key in spotting troubled kids.
Yes.
And they've got to get up to speed on what are some of the warning signs. They've got to, because you look at any of these adolescent kids and they all left some kind of message.
I have long advocated that is something that we should be doing as part of our teacher training is everybody needs to have a seminar on how do you spot warning signs for these students.
Yeah, the other group are school nurses, because
Yes,
a lot of these
yes, ma'am.
kids go to the school nurse for things, and she knows the ones that are having trouble and not. So between teachers and school nurses, I think should be a better training for them.
Yeah, agreed, absolutely. At the end of the day, what do you both do to separate yourself out from this incredibly difficult subject matter? Because this has to just be an incredible weight on you. How do you step away from it at the end of the day?
You mean while we were writing the book? Because we were more immersed,
Yes.
of course, in writing the book.
Yes.
I guess we each have our own way. I like music. I put music on and do something else or teach. I think teaching is why I like to teach, because I feel like I'm doing something for the next generation to learn.
You had said that early on when we first started working on this and you started sharing some of the photos of crime scenes and things like that to work off of. I'd said, how did you deal with this? Seeing this every day, it must have been really hard. And you were quick to point out that you never lost your empathy, but you always viewed it as data and something that if you understood it, if you learned from it, maybe that could help somebody else down the road. So that was always your motivation.
And I think, that's why detectives do. You're always looking for something to explain something. So if you take that kind of inquiry on what this case is all about and who did it, we're working now with a cold case group, and that's been very interesting to see people going back 20, 30 years on a case that never got solved. And you could say, why do they do it? It isn't just that they want to find out who the killer was, but it's for the family, because everybody else has forgotten. It's I know we have this one case, and it's been the mother's 9-year-old daughter was alive at the time of her mother's murder, and this was back in the 80s, and so she's now in her 40s. And she said she reached out to us to say she was so happy that somebody cared about her mother.
If you'd ever want me to talk about the Colonial Parkway murders, my sister's murder and Rebecca Dowski's, that's 35 years now. And that's been an FBI case since the very beginning. And the case continues to move forward, but sometimes it feels like with glacial speed.
Incremental.
Is it with which agency is it with? The BSU?
It's with the FBI. It's always been handled by FBI Norfolk and Newport News.
Okay.
And it's been a long just slog. And then there are 3 other double homicides that are considered part of the Colonial Parkway murders, although nothing in the forensics actually links the other double homicides. It's just circumstantial. Couples, cars, isolated rural locations, Lover's Lane situations in and around Williamsburg, Virginia. 2 of the cases are FBI cases because they happened inside the national park, the Colonial Parkway. And then 2 of the cases are Virginia State Police cases because they happened outside the national park. The lack of information sharing between the agencies and the friction back then, this is in 86 to 89, didn't help us move these cases forward. And of course, this is before DNA has come out of the lab, really. So crime scenes were not secured in the way they would be in 2022. So we're challenged with evidence that's 30 to 35 years old and wasn't well preserved by contemporary standards. I'm not criticizing, but when you have first responders climbing into vehicles to examine body, that wouldn't happen if we had a terrible thing like that happen today. But back then, that was how the crime scenes were handled. There's always been a sense in our case, by the way, that law enforcement or an imposter may be involved because of the way these couples were approached. We're still finding ourselves in the cold case and unsolved category all these years later.
Have you had a cold case group look at it?
I would love that if the opportunity presented itself.
And you might think of Greg Cooper, because he's a retired FBI, and he's out of Utah, and I know he's doing one of our cases. We have a super sleuth group, and he's doing a case from the Netherlands.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
He's going international. So we're really looking forward to it. But
we would welcome that.
I wonder if Greg would look at it, because he's bureau. He's former bureau.
We'd love that. We can talk about that off air.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say we were told at one point that the BSU did take a look at the Colonial Parkway murders case, but we can't seem to get anybody on the record about that. So we don't even know which profilers would have looked at it. I know people have asked John about it a number of times, and he said he's familiar with the case, but he isn't willing to speak about it. I'm hoping at some point we get a little bit more information about that, but apparently the BSU has seen it. So your next book venture, it sounds like you're already hard at work on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? Stephen, I'll start with you and then you can kick it to Anne.
Sure. So it basically would pick up where A Killer by Design leaves off right after the Henry Louis Wallace case, where Dr. Burgess' career starts to shift a little bit towards the legal side of her work as an expert witness and giving testimony on everything that she learned throughout her work, studying victims of sexual trauma and developing criminal profiling for the BSU. And it picks up on all that, and then it applies it to the criminal justice system with some big cases that she worked on, including the Menendez brothers, the Larry Nassar. So there's a lot of great content there, and it's another one of those instances of trying to take so much material and wrangle it down into something that's easier to consume.
When things go well, which we are sure they will, any idea when the book would be finished? I know that's a hard question to answer.
It's getting there. It's not too far off. Stephen, we've got...
Yeah, we have a good chunk of it written, but this was a process the first time around where we had more chapters written than ended up being in the book. As it got edited and landed with its publisher, things just change a little bit. So we've got a good chunk down, and we'll see how much of that lasts.
That's fantastic. The book is A Killer by Design, Murderers, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind by Anne Burgess and Steven Constantine. Thank you both for joining us on Mind Over Murder today. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.